So I was initially going to create a video going over all of the settings and various slicers until I started scripting it and I realized this is really boring and no one's going to watch this. Besides that, Prusa has a really good guide on their website that goes over all the settings in Prusa Slicer, which almost all slicers are based off nowadays, or at least Slicer. So I'll link that in the description if you want an in-depth look at every single setting you could think of. So instead, I'm going to make a video on the settings that I change the most, so that way the video can be a little more succinct and relatable. So before we jump into the slicer...
Slicer? I hardly know her!
I do want to take a minute to talk about YouTube's ads. So there's no sponsor for today, but YouTube is changing the way that ads on YouTube videos work, and I wanted to mention it. So previously, I used to turn off unskippable ads on all my videos, because who wants to see that? And then I got this email from YouTube, and I can't turn that off anymore. So they're enabling all ad types on every video, and content creators can't change it. No, I can hear some of you already. I use an ad blocker. What ads? I don't even know what you're talking about. That's okay, I get it. I use an ad blocker too. But I do recommend, if you can afford it, YouTube Premium. And I can already hear people saying stuff about that too. It's expensive, why would I do that? I'm not giving Google any more money. That's fine, you don't have to. Google's obviously not paying me to shill out for this, but it is a good way to support the creators you watch, because that money that you pay for YouTube Premium obviously blocks ads on everything, including your TV and your computer. But the creators you watch will get a bigger payout based on YouTube Premium views. So that's all I want to say, that you're going to start seeing even more ads on my videos, and that is one small way you could get around it if you wanted to. I'll go ahead and get off my soapbox, but you might see more unskippable ads on my videos. So, actually jumping into the slicer. I'm going to start in Bamboo Slicer, since a lot of my videos are centered around bamboo products. And a lot of these settings you're going to find in Prusa Slicer, Orca Slicer, Super Slicer, and even others like Cura. So starting at the top here, the first thing that I do is create a copy of my printer. And this really only applies to Bambu Lab printers, but the reason I do this, at least for my X1, is so that I can go in here, go to Extruder, and change Z-Hop type to normal. Z-Hop is when your printer is done with a move, and it needs to move the tool head somewhere else. It'll actually drop the bed, in the case of an X1, or just move the Z-axis up, then move the tool head, then move it back down. That's a Z-Hop. And you might have noticed, if you've had an X1 or a Bambu Lab printer for a while, that the default used to be spiral. So instead of it just hopping up and moving over, it would spiral up and then move over. I don't particularly like that option. It's a lot of movement for no real gain. And I found that most of the time it would be a little more blobby in that spot, more than just the normal, which is just up. There's another setting here, which is slope, which is where instead of just moving straight up, it moves away at a slope to help maybe reduce stringing or blobbing. But I find normal works for me. Try it out for yourself and see which one works for you. From here, you could change some of the G-code in your start and end G-codes. I'm not going to go over that, but having a copy of your printer allows you to do this kind of a thing. For the rest of these settings, a lot of them are going to be print dependent. I don't really change any of these globally, so it depends on what you're printing and what you want it to look like. But I'll cover the settings that I end up changing the most, and I'll show some relevant examples and prints when it's applicable. Starting off here in the quality tab, I will actually sometimes change some of my extrusion widths, particularly on the top surface. I will sometimes change this from the default 0.42 to maybe something wider, depending on how I want my top surface to look. You could also do something similar with ironing. It just depends on what your print calls for and what you see after you print it, and if you want to change something. You could also change this with your extrusion multiplier that I talked about in my previous videos, and you could also change this with top surface flow, but that's only in Orca Slicer, and it isn't here in Bamboo Studio. Seam position is actually something I change quite frequently, and you'll notice here that there's 4 options: nearest, aligned, back, and random. I actually see people on Reddit all the time asking about why there's random zits all over their print. And more often than not, the reason that happens is because they were using a random seam placement. So at the beginning and end of every layer, when it finishes and it has to go to the next one, it has to end the layer somewhere and start the next one. That's going to create your Z-seam. So when you do random, it's going to do that at a random section of each layer. If we slice this benchy here and it's set to random, and we turn on seams up here on the right, you can see these white sections are the seam where it's going to end the layer. And if we were to print it like this, even if our pressure advance was super dialed in, you would notice this everywhere all over the print. And I have an example here that I can show. And even here in this tiny little example, you can see that there's these little blobs or these little imperfections all over the print, and that's because of setting this to random. There could be a time to use this depending on the print, but for the most part, I really don't recommend this setting. For me, I personally either manually paint my seams or I use back. Now, if you look at these settings, one of them is called aligned, and you would think that this aligns it vertically in the Z. And theoretically, that's what it should do. And if we slice this, you can see that for the most part, all of these sections, the seam is aligned vertically. But I find that the back setting actually aligns it more. I'm not really sure why. And if I use this back setting, I will set it and then I will turn my print such that the back of the print is facing the back of the printer, and that's the side that I want my seam to be on. So if we turn this to back, and if I want the seam on the back of the benchy here, I'll rotate it. And if we slice it, you can see that it's pretty well aligned on the back of the actual print. And there's really no way for this to be in like one solid thing up a benchy or something similar to this. But you can see that we have a pretty good alignment of it, and it shouldn't be all over the place, and it should be pretty well hidden when we print it. And if you really want to get fancy with this, well, almost all slicers have manual seam painting, and you can just paint this wherever you want it. So that way you can put it exactly where you want it to be and hide it however you want to hide it. And there you go. The seam is painted, or the seam is placed where I painted it along the back here. And for all the sections that I didn't paint it, it put it in the back. Here under precision, I will sometimes use this XY hole compensation. So what this is for is if you have a hole like this one here in your print, and you print it and it's not quite dimensionally accurate, you can space out just the holes by this setting. I realized that this could probably be fixed with better tuning, better extrusion multiplier, what have you. But instead of going back and editing your model or doing any more tuning on your printer if the rest of the print was fine, you can just change this setting, give some more tolerance to these holes, and still have the print work. Ironing is also something that I will use sometimes. What this does is it goes back over these top layers so that it fills them back in with a little more plastic with the hot nozzle touching it and remelting to make glass smooth top layers. This does take a little bit of tuning. If you turn it on, you see you get a couple extra options. You can choose the pattern, you can choose the speed, the flow, and the spacing. And once you get this dialed in, you get perfect top layers. So this is something I will use sometimes on prints that I need to sell or prints that I really want to look good. Wall generator. This is something I will change almost always. Because the classic wall generator, what this does is it uses a constant extrusion width when it creates the perimeters in your print. And this sounds okay, but the Arachne, what that will do is it will constantly modify the width of the extrusion, so it'll help your print to actually be the dimensions that are part of your model. Now, I'm not saying Classic won't hit the dimensions, but what the Classic will do is if we slice this and we scroll down, you can see in sections like this, and if we look on the right, this is gap infill. So this thickness of the walls right here isn't quite exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 walls. So it has to go back and fill this in with gap infill. I don't particularly like this gap infill. Usually it just makes things a mess. If we switch this to Arachne, you can see that here it is actually just using regular infill. But if we change in the top right the color scheme to line width, you can see that overall the line width isn't as consistent as it was with the classic wall generator. And especially if we scroll down here into the bottom, you can start to see these colors changing because it's dynamically changing that line width to give you an overall better print. This can be especially useful if you're printing with a bigger nozzle. It can help you do smaller details than you normally would have been with the classic generator. There are definitely times where Arachne actually kind of hurts your print, but I recommend Arachne for most prints. But if you find that there's some kind of extrusion width that's not quite right, switching back to Classic might help. One thing to note is that when you switch to Arachne, that there are settings here to change. I personally don't really change any of them, but you can mess around with these to see if there's anything that can help this Arachne perimeter generator. Here under Advanced, I actually do change a few of these settings quite often, especially the order of the walls. The default here is inner outer infill, which I find is good for most prints. So what this will do is if we slice this and we scroll through a layer, it'll print the inner perimeters outwards and then print the outer perimeters last. One problem that this can have is error stacking outwards from your print. So if this first perimeter is slightly wrong, slightly too thick or slightly too thin, as it prints outwards, that error will translate to the outer perimeter of your print, and you can see that even though it was an inner perimeter. If you want to help the outer perimeter, the outermost perimeter of your print to look better, you can choose to print the outer perimeter first. So if we slice this and we scroll through the layer, it prints that outer perimeter first, so you know it's put down nicely, and then it starts to print inside, so that error would stack into your print where you wouldn't really see it as much. There is a downside to printing the outside first. If you did something like a pause print and the tool head had to move away, stop extruding filament, and then start again, when it starts it might not be perfect. So I do recommend to use like a prime tower or print another model or something, just so it can start extruding and then go to the model that you want to look good and do your outer perimeter. But there's another setting here, which is inner infill. And if we look at this, and we scroll through the layer, it'll start to do these inner perimeters first, then do your outer, and then print the middle layer, which gets around the need for doing a prime tower to do your outermost perimeter, because it does the innermost one first. And if that looks bad, it doesn't matter because it's on the inside of your print. Then, without the error stacking of all of those perimeters stacked together, it'll print the outside and then squish the middle one in. And theoretically, your outermost perimeter should be cooled at that point, and you shouldn't see as much error. This is a good choice, and if you're not using it, I definitely recommend trying it out and seeing if it helps. Bridge flow is something that I've changed on a lot of my prints actually, especially on my X1. I find that even small little bridges like this, if I print with this one bridge flow, this bridge will tend to get a little messed up. It'll squish it together to the point where when I print the next layer over top of it, it doesn't really have a perfect layer over it. And especially because this print only has 2 layers over this hole, I really have to make sure that bridge looks great. So when you reduce this bridge flow, it'll make it so when it's actually printed like this, it's not a fully thick layer. And that's fine as long as there's enough support to make the layer over top of it look good. So you can play around with this setting. Maybe you want them thicker to make them go longer, or maybe you want them thinner, so that way you can reduce the amount of material that's built up over the hole, and then maybe the layer that goes over top of it will look a little better. The thick bridges option can kind of do this for you automatically. It'll make the bridges not the same layer height as the layer height that you're printing with, and it will help them to span longer distances, but you're gonna have to deal with your bridges looking thicker than the rest of your print. And last here in the quality tab is only one wall on top surfaces and only one wall on the first layer. I do tend to change this for most of my prints, especially when I print with a lot of walls. So if we look at the very top of this print, I like the way that this looks with only one wall and then the solid infill, rather than having all of these perimeters visible from the top of the print. I just think it looks cleaner. And if the bottom of the print is going to be interfaced with after you print it, I will do the same thing and only print one perimeter on my first layer, so that way it also looks a little bit better. All right, let's move over into the strength tab. For wall loops, I think 2 is kind of the minimum, unless you want to print in vase mode in particular. If you have any less than 2, so 1 wall, your infill, depending on the color of your filament, might show through the wall. If you're just trying to do a draft print or a quick print, this is a good option to maybe save some time. But I think for most prints, 2 is kind of the minimum. And the easiest way to add strength to a print is to increase the number of walls. You might think that increasing the infill or even doing completely solid infill is how you would make a stronger print. But when it comes to the amount of filament that you're extruding and the time, adding walls is definitely the best way to do it. I typically use 3 to 6 walls depending on how strong I want the print to be. But keep in mind, if you're printing something really small like this, If you increase your wall count way up, it gets to the point where like almost the whole print is walls, and I don't think that this is really worth the time or the filament. So depending on the size of your print, you may choose to use less walls, or if it's a big print, you may want to choose more walls. Another thing to keep in mind is that your wall width isn't exactly your extrusion width multiplied by the number of walls that you picked. Prusa has a really good write-up on this because the walls actually do overlap. So keep that in mind when you're designing models and trying to think of the amount of walls that will fill the thickness. Next is going to be your top surface and bottom surface fill patterns, as well as your solid infill surface patterns. A lot of this is actually down to personal preference, especially for your top surface, just depending on how you want it to look. If you want it to look cool or have an interesting pattern, you might choose Hilbert Curve because it looks cool. And if you want it to look like that, go for it. For most prints, I use either monotonic or monotonic line. And if you look at monotonic versus rectilinear, you might say, oh, well, they look exactly the same. What's the difference? So this is rectilinear and this is monotonic. The difference between rectilinear and monotonic is that while the finished product might look the same, monotonic keeps this pattern going in one direction. It never changes. So monotonic will actually give you a cleaner looking top surface. Now the difference between monotonic and monotonic lines is that monotonic has this little anchor here that anchors to the walls of your print. I've found that if your print has circular patterns in it like this, if we choose monotonic line, you can see that there's a little space that it doesn't fill in. And if you look, this is white. This is actually gap infill. So if you've ever done a print where at the end, when it finishes that top surface and you see it like put a bunch of little blobs all over the print, this is why, or it could be why. And I've found, especially if I'm doing a curved surface like this on the top, I will use monotonic because these little anchors that fill in reduce the need for that gap infill, and you can actually see it's gone. There's no gap fill on this print. So depending on what you want your top surface to look like, you would choose one of these options. For your internal solid infill pattern, there's almost no reason not to choose rectilinear, because even though it would look bad, this is an internal surface, so it doesn't really matter what it looks like, and rectilinear prints a little bit faster because there's less computation needed to come up with this pattern than there is to keep it all the same during monotonic. For the number of layers that you use on your top surface, this is also dependent on how strong you want your print to be, but also keep in mind that the fewer layers you choose, and especially if you were to just choose one, it would have to print that last surface over your infill. And so if your infill percentage is low, it might not be able to bridge, it probably won't be able to bridge over the infill all the way, and that top surface is going to look bad. So 2 is kind of the minimum, but if you want your top surface to look as good as it possibly can, adding more helps, and if you want your print to be strong, adding more helps as well. Especially if I want my print to look good, I think 4 is the minimum, and on a lot of the prints that I sell, I will do 5 or even 6. You can set this with a thickness value instead, but I usually will just set these thickness values to 0, and just go based off of the number of layers, which leads us to your infill density and type. This is something I will change pretty much every print, just depending on what I want to accomplish. For sparse infill density, I think 10% is probably close to the minimum, just depending on how large the gaps are in the print or where it needs to print the infill. Because if you try to do something less than 10%, remember that your top solid layers have to bridge over this, or at least the first one does. And if you choose something that's super low, it has to bridge over this huge gap. And like, look at this layer right here. This is printing a circle into midair pretty much. So if you try to go too low to save time or filament, it can actually hurt you because it won't be able to print over this. For infill pattern, again, Prusa has a really good write-up on all of the differences between these, and there's a lot to choose from. For me, I pretty much always print with gyroid. In terms of speed and strength, I find that this one is kind of the best of both worlds, and even if you read that Prusa article, agree with them or not, they typically recommend gyroid, or you'll find that grid is usually the default in a lot of slicers profiles. I don't particularly like grid myself because while it's fast, it does intersect here at these corners, leading for these corners to build up. And if you've ever done a print with this infill and when it's going over, it's because these are raised and your nozzle is actually scraping against these. If you're printing something thin and tall, it can actually knock your print all the way over. I'd rather just not deal with that, and I just use gyroid. There is a cool thing you can do though, where if you choose no top solid layers or bottom layers, if you set both of these to 0, you can play around with some of these infill types like honeycomb, and you can actually get a cool pattern in your print even when it's all the way done. And you can get this visible honeycomb pattern like this example right here through your whole print. If I'm printing something and I want it to be done quickly, I will sometimes use support cubic. And what this does is it leaves it kind of sparse at the bottom and prints rather quick. But when it gets towards the top where it's going to need to bridge over it, you'll start to see it get a little bit more dense. So that way it's easier for that top solid to bridge over it. So as far as slicer settings for my actual prints, that's about it. There are other settings I will change, but for the most part, those are the ones that I mess with the most. Again, just like your filament settings, a lot of this is print dependent. So look at your print while it's printing or when it's done, or use these color schemes in the slicer to check out what's going on before you send the print. You can check things like speed as it's going up for each layer. You can check things like layer height, which for this it's consistent. You can check your line width, and these color schemes can help you to diagnose a print even before you send it to your printer. Remember, the slicer is telling you exactly what your printer is going to do. This is the G code in a visual format of what it's going to be doing. For models that I really want to look good, I will spend a large amount of time checking things out, checking all these different color schemes, and changing things before I even send it to the printer. Then, like I said in my other videos, I will watch the print, see if anything needs to change, and make the adjustments in the slicer. Alright, so I hope that gives you guys a basic understanding of some of the settings in your slicer, especially if you're newer to 3D printing. Definitely comment some of the settings that you changed that I didn't cover, or anything that's helped you with one of your prints where something went wrong and a setting helped fix it. As always, if you learned something, smash the absolute shit out of that like button. And honestly, forget all of this tuning nonsense, because if you subscribe, it keeps your prints buttery smooth. I'll see you in the next one.